Hey Jason, how you doing?
So
Not sure how many to expect. Not sure how many to expect. Craig.
yeah. Um,
Hello.
hey Greg.
I'm gonna
Hey.
keep my video off for while I'm eating breakfast.
It looks like we don't have an agenda today. So I think we'll just, when we're ready to start, just have an open discussion about whatever we feel like needs to be discussed.
Hello.
Day one.
Hey on.
Hey, how's everybody?
Good.
Yeah, not bad, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. I don't know how you stay so late, Ben, on a Monday in the UK. I would be completely brain dead if I was you.
Yeah, usually I come home from training to this, but not today. It's paused for summer.
Cool, cool.
Yeah, I'm useless at that hour.
That's the bad part of being in Europe, actually. We stay, late. Kind of sucks.
Yeah, it's only once a week, and it's the only chance we can get to get everyone together, so make it work.
Yeah. It's all Greg's fault being all the way in New Zealand, making things harder.
What I could do later.
Yeah,
Or
it's always the
if you really
outlier.
want to flip it, if you really want to flip it, we can go late at night for me, which would be very early for Ben. And I don't think anybody else would be awake.
Yeah, well, try to set up meetings on my team. For a period, we had people ranging from California to Japan, which is pretty much impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, I've tried to work with people in India from California, and it's that was impossible. They were nice enough to a lot of them actually work in the very late hours uh, to accommodate us.
They all do actually. They are very used to it,
Yeah,
apparently in India, which is yeah, horrible.
And I've settled into a rhythm where my work day starts when I get up, and then I take the kids to like I do an hour or so. I take the kids to school. I come back. I do a few more hours. I have during the day to do things, and then I come back to it like at 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. That's the only way that I can get stuff done. And by getting stuff done, I mean coordinating with people. Because Julian and Ben are all in Europe, and I have a few people in the Americas time zones, and then me. So I have a split work day.
So we can all move to a single place, right? A coordinated international move. That'll be fun.
New Zealand's hiring.
I definitely want to go visit New Zealand.
Yeah, let's all move to New Zealand. That sounds good. Action item, Jason to
There we go.
record.
Yeah. Well, speaking of action items, it's been 5 minutes, so I think we can get started. Assume this is most everybody that we're going to get. I'll be your facilitator today. We don't have any action items from the last meeting, and we don't have any agenda for today. So I was thinking we just leave things open for any discussion that people want to talk about. I guess we should start with, are there any updates from people about progress on roadmap issues? I'll start. I think we're almost ready to merge the conversion of the spec to Markdown. Just waiting for an approval from Ben. I made the changes that were asked, so I think we should just be ready to go on that.
Cool, yeah, I'll make sure I have a look at that when I come back on Thursday.
Yeah. And then when that's done, I'll look into the writing up some changes for a couple of issues that were in the spec pipeline that we have already agreed on.
The charter has been sitting, waiting for the 2-week period, and waiting for discussion at the OpenJS Foundation CPC meeting. There's been a comment left by Austin, which has raised a number of questions, which need talking about and discussing and replying to. I know Greg left a comment in Slack channel to say he had some thoughts on that. But yeah, not a lot to say on that at the moment, other than I think most of the concerns are not big issues that we can't overcome. And some of them, I think maybe 1 or 2 of them aren't necessarily relevant to the charter. And there might have been some confusion over what the charter looks to achieve versus what Austin thinks it's supposed to be saying. So I think that's one of the avenues I'll be trying to address when I come back from vacation. I'm pretty much going to be out all of this week and next week, so it's not the best time to get that sort of comment. Personally, I find it a little bit frustrating that it's the first comment in 6 months. That pull request has been open for 6 months. I know he did say that he hasn't had a lot of time, he's been quite busy, but 6 months does feel like quite a long window of opportunity to raise major concerns. So that's personally a little bit disappointing.
I think Austin just wants clarification on things. Like I said, I think he may be, he may have an assumption that the charter is supposed to do some things that it's not supposed to do, or that we still need to define, but we maybe should define elsewhere. I'm not sure. I still need to go through his thing. I'm going to do that after this meeting. But he raises a lot of good topical things that I agree with, just in general, but I need to address those specifically in the context of the charter itself.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will say, just as an immediate response to one part is, the charter says that the project is concerned with publishing the specification. The charter doesn't define where that publication has to happen. So if there are discussions about where the publication publication of the specification needs to be. They can be ongoing regardless of the charter. The charter doesn't constrain those. That's the only thing I think I would mention for now. This was highlighted to me by someone from the OpenJS Foundation, which I think is actually quite helpful at this point.
Yeah, I think that should address Austin's major issues, and I think the rest are mostly misunderstandings. At least that was my impression. All right. Is there any other issues that people want to discuss?
Not an issue, but something that came across my desk, so to speak, today. I dropped it in water cooler channel on our JSON Schema Slack server. There was a post by Phil Sturgeon, who's been prolific in the API community for many years. He discovered a command in a tool by Redocly, I think, which would split a massive open API or an open API document into many schemas and put references in for each of those. So it broke up open API documents into many files, which is something I have never seen anybody actually do as a tool. So it's nice to see that is out there, and actually that's a direction people might want to take. I think it's a good and useful signal.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. Well, an interesting thing that we might want to discuss is I started a discussion a few weeks ago about how we might want to evolve the spec. I think Greg and I were the only ones who are involved in that discussion so far. I think we disagree on some things, but I think there's plenty of room to get a compromise there. I'm willing to try the way that Greg wants to do it. I think if I think it's easy enough to add more processes later than it is to take some away if it turns out to be too much. And Greg's is more light, I guess. So I think that's a reasonable place to start. I think that the thing that was in debate is the question of how we require, or if we require, when we require the implementation of certain features of experimental features. So I guess to summarize, I was I can share this this link in the chat here so you guys can look at it. I think what Greg was saying was that we should have separate documents for any experimental features, and then when they're optional to implement, and then when they're accepted as full-fledged features, they should be moved to, or they can be moved to the full spec, and then be required. My preference is to have a kind of staged or a progressive stepping towards required functionality. The original, like at first, the feature is not required. People implement it if they feel like they want to, and then it would be moved into the spec, but still be optional to implement. And then the final step is that it's not the final step. The next step is that it would be made required, but still labeled as experimental. And then finally, the experimental flag is removed. And the reason for that is because I want people to be required to implement some features as we introduce them. Otherwise, I think people just aren't going to implement new features. They feel like, oh, when you guys have that all settled, then I'll implement it. And then that defeats the purpose of getting feedback on the feature before we declare stable. So does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think I'm less concerned with whether we make it required or not, although I would go on I would err on the side of not, and I'm more concerned with how can we incentivize people to implement those, because when people don't like stuff in the spec, even when it's explicitly required as a must, they just don't do it, right? Or they get it wrong, or they don't use the test suite. So how can we incentivize people? And I think there's a couple of ways we can do that through the test suite, like demonstrating like there's some things over here that you can go and implement that for extra credit. And secondly, we can highlight those implementations in our list of implementations. Like, here are the implementations that are involved in the community, that are assisting the project in determining whether these solutions are really going to work for you. If you're like thinking of sponsoring an implementation or picking an implementation, these ones are going to be the most active and useful for you. And that will help implementers, and also financial incentives. Like, hey, if you as an implementer can implement the proposals which make it to stage 2, then maybe we think about some way of financially compensating those which meet those requirements or meet that stage.
Yeah, I think that's in line with what Greg was arguing too, generally, that there are other paths that we can take to encourage people to implement these things. And I'm willing to give that a try. Like I said, it's kind of the, like not requiring it is the lighter approach, and starting with the lighter approach is, I think, a good idea. And then in the future, if we find that, well, none of this stuff is working and people actually aren't implementing these things, then we can move towards, or consider moving towards a heavier hand with actually making things required.
Juan, do you have any opinion as an implementer yourself on this?
I don't think I have gone enough the rabbit hole to have a strong opinion on either. Let me think about more. I don't think I have anything immediate to add on that.
But just as a general thought, like, would you be inclined to implement something that's experimental if it was required, or if it was only a suggestion, even if it's a strong suggestion, would that have an impact on?
I would definitely experiment with the suggestions, right? But I think, I mean, what you raise up as a problem is that even if you say must, for example, people don't even obey that, right? I think even the what I've seen a lot is that even implementations might go and get quite a way into it without even reading the spec at all, right? So there's all these variants, and that's what I'm saying. I think it really depends on who's looking into it. I think this group in particular is biased. I think we have read the spec many times, and we're gonna probably tend to obey what it says or what it suggests even more than other people. But I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so like one of the ways to combat that is to put some of these experimental features in the test suite as required features, and then they don't have to read the spec. They just because I think most implementations are using the test suite. So I mean, all they gotta do is run the test suite and see that, oh, I'm not implementing this feature. I guess I need to do that.
Ideally,
Yeah,
if we
no,
could
that's
bow
fair.
tie to this particular point, then they don't have to run the test suite. What I was thinking is, and we really should probably have Julian here for this. What I was thinking is we categorize all the tests. I mean, they're already separated by keyword. But then you could say, oh, this test suite really doesn't implement references really well. Or, this test suite does everything except for unevaluated properties. You could isolate the deficiencies in the implementations using the test suite and bow tie. They don't even have to run that, because bow tie would do it for them and then create the report and say, hey, when you're selecting an implementation, go look at what it actually supports. I think that would be a big driver for implementers to support experimental features.
I mean, talking about that, how does bow tie or the test suite even works, for example, with optional features at the moment, like the format assertion vocabulary? Is that even run? Because I think that's one example of something that is like kind of opt-in.
It doesn't. It needs some development. It doesn't do that, but it's certainly a direction that I think is worth going, because then we could give some recommendations on what implementations to use, and it could be live updated. So we're not saying, oh, well, AJV historically has done well with these things, just go with AJV. It's AJV has done well with these things, but now now Hyperjump is coming up, and Hyperjump does everything. Maybe leave AJV behind. Those kinds of things. That's something that bow tie can reveal to people.
Just noticed that Hyperjump isn't actually on there.
It is.
It is
on bow tie.
Yeah, I think the something that's missing with bow tie right now, that would be necessary is notifications of failures and to the implementers that are responsible for those things. Because I noticed there was a bug in Test Runner a while ago, and just because I happened to go look at bow tie one time for some other reason, and saw that my implementation was showing failures, and who knows how long it was like that before I noticed.
Yeah, bow tie definitely needs some more work. It's still a work in progress. But yeah, I wish I had the know-how of how to do the web development needed to help it along, but I don't.
Oh, Ben, it looks like you're right. It's my implementation has disappeared.
Yeah, I've just noticed there's new like language filtering things, and I'm guessing there's a problem with those, but maybe not because AJV isn't showing up for 2019-09, but it is for 2012. So and like draft 7 is showing a lot more implementation. So yeah, I don't know what's going on, but there's something afoot.
Yeah, well, Julian disqualified your implementation, Jason. Guess we cannot use it anymore. Sorry.
All right. Well, see, well, there's another case of what I was talking about. And when there's issues, you just don't know that until you happen to look for it. Yeah. Well, I'll have to look into what's wrong with that. But yeah, it sounds like there's a good amount of agreement here. That we want to start simple with not requiring things, but encourage implementers to implement experimental features through other channels, especially Bowtie. All right, so I'll put in an update on that discussion, and I think that's a big roadblock, I think, for us. If we have an agreement on that part, there's a lot now that we can do with getting the spec updated for the next release.
Yeah, I think once we have an editable spec and we have our process down, I think the next step is going through all the language, make sure that that's what we need, and then also identifying all of the features that we have, which we've done some work months ago on, but identifying the features that we have and determining which features we want to, have an initial release of stable and then have an initial release of some level of experimental.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's actually another thing that I think is missing. So I did miss something, is what's the scope of what we're going to include in the initial release. Obviously, I think none of the newer changes that were proposed, like property dependencies, I think that can wait and be experimental. And but other things like a vocabulary system, like, are we going to call that experimental?
I think so.
I think so too, but there were other opinions. So I think it's probably something that still needs some discussion.
Well, even
Well, here's
Henry
one thing.
recognized that it was an incomplete thing.
Yeah, I think Julian's the only one who's really thinks that if it if it was in the spec, it should be considered stable.
Okay, yeah. From that point of view, if you look at just the 2012 spec, or I guess the 2012 and the 2019 spec, not 2012, 2020, 2019 and 2020 specs, since it's in those documents that aren't going to change, yes, from that point of view, vocabulary as rendered in those documents is stable. But as a lifetime feature, vocabularies are not stable.
So what does that mean? Do we leave it in and mark it as experimental, or do we pull it out, or do we leave it as is and deprecate it for future better solution?
I think we leave it in for now because we don't have a future better solution yet, except for what I've proposed somewhere. It's the best thing that we have right now. I think it should be experimental because I'm hoping that it doesn't stay around in its current state. Either it evolves or it goes away. But it's an unfinished thing right now.
Yeah. My preference, I think, would be to extract it into its own spec, because that's what we just decided we were going to do with experimental features.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then, like you said, we either replace it or evolve it from there.
Yeah. Something I just thought of in the past few minutes is putting experimental features in separate documents does seem like a lot of overhead and work. We have a lot of experimental features running, and that's going to be a lot of documents flying around. So I think that's a point to Jason's preference of keeping everything inside the one document and just yeah, maybe we have one experimental document. Like we have a core document and we have a validation document. Maybe we also have an experimental document that eventually things get promoted out of the single experimental document into one of the other two. I don't know.
I mean, having individual documents would be a parallel to how the stages system works for like ECMA. And yeah, there are a lot of documents, but you have an index and you use the index, and I mean they have a whole repo for each proposal, which has more than just the spec, and it has the tests. So actually it might end up being a folder per proposed feature. And I don't think they're going to be loads of them. I think they're going to be probably less than you anticipate. But going back to the discussion about vocabularies, I mean, if you're saying, are we saying parts of vocabulary system isn't stable, or are we saying the whole thing isn't stable? Because if you're saying the whole thing isn't stable, then you don't have a model for starting processing, right?
That's a good point, and it's the same problem for dynamic references. Oops, did we just lose somebody? No. Yeah. So I mean, yeah. We can't do either of those things without what we have already. But I guess we're expecting people to implement these experimental features. So does it really matter that it's in a separate document? Juan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask about, so the intention between this experimental thing is, as you said, Jason, is that we want people to actually implement those, but then because they are experimental, they might be backwards compatibility changes, or is the idea to actually try to say, okay, this is coming, but you probably should not implement it yet. And I guess by somebody taking a look at the spec, they might get different impression of what it means experimental. I guess from where you're coming from, you might want to, okay, should I try it out or should I stay away from it? And I guess what's the original intention as a team, it can influence how you present it.
I think for me, my intention is that people, especially the implementers, implement it. Schema authors have to take care about whether they want to use it or not. But I think they should be encouraged to do so, especially at the later stages of the stability. Like a really good example is in Node.js, they have recently added the fetch API to their libraries, and it was originally disabled by default, but it's there for people to use if they want to enable it. And then in the next version, they enable it by default, but it's still labeled as experimental. And then you know, in a future release, it'll be you know, available and not experimental. I think that kind of progression is a pretty good sends good signals to users. Like, you know, if you're setting if you have to set a flag to use this thing, you know that you're on the cutting edge. But you know, if it's enabled by default, you're encouraging the masses to use it, even though you're not committing to, you know, this is stable. This is 100% stable at this point.
But so then there are two facets to it, right? So one facet is that, is this considered stable or unstable, you know, / experimental? And then the other facet is that, is this supposed to be optional or required? And you can play, you know, with both of those things.
Yeah, and currently we're saying, you know, we're not going to use the required, you know, tool, I guess. But that is something we could use in the future. Yeah, at this point, we're only using the experimental or not experimental indicators.
Well, is it the same as required and optional then? Because it almost, you know, kind of used in that way, right? Like imagine if you have like this new experimental feature, but instead of marking it as experimental or unstable, because I think as soon as we say experimental, most people just shy away from it. Even in Node, right? Node is specifically like, as soon as this is experimental, almost nobody except the core team will touch any of that, right? Whereas, for example, what happens if the idea is to encourage adoption, then maybe another way would be to not mark it as scary as it would sound with experimental, but just make it option.
Yeah,
that sounds less scary, I think.
Yeah, and I'll say for me, it's actually whether it's enabled by default or not is the thing that is the thing that scares me away or not. It's like the example I just used with fetch. If when it requires me to turn on a flag in Node to make it work, I'm not going to use it. But if it just works, then that's probably okay. And I'm willing
But
to.
if it just works, then you assume it's not experimental. That's you assume it's stable, and that's why you use it.
Unless you look at the documentation. Yeah, that's true.
And, well, yeah, and about a quarter of developers look at documentation.
Well, yeah, well, I did in this case. I'm using the fetch API. It is currently labeled as experimental, and I knew that it was. I looked at the documentation and saw. So.
Yeah, you're also setting up to author specifications, so you're probably not a good representative of the developer masses.
Yeah, but I think my point is that it's not whether we're encouraging users to use it or not. So I mean, I think you're saying like people should be more scared than they would be if they were using something and didn't really know that it was experimental. But I think we're in a place where when we're enabling it by default, we're in a place where it's stable enough that people should be comfortable using it.
Well, I think it's even then more difficult because there's a third facet, which is that even if this is experimental or optional or required, whatever, at the implementation level, we don't have any control of what somebody's going to do with their implementation. They might actually go ahead, implement a completely experimental feature and not mark it as experimental or opt-in in their implementation and just make it by default, and people would not. Again, I agree with Greg that most people will not look at documentation, but the people that, at least a quarter of developers that would look at documentation, they would probably look at the implementation documentation and the spec. So they might still never be aware that this was experimental from the JSON schema point of view.
I think the most important thing to my mind is how do we keep the level of interoperability that users expect? How do we avoid surprises? How do we avoid things failing unexpectedly?
Yeah, I was about to raise that as well. I think we need maybe a different word other than experimental, or unstable. I'm not sure, but I think the idea that we're going for is, hey, use this, but it may not work as you expect it to. Or hey, use this. This is what it should do right now. We're still looking for feedback, and based on that feedback, it may change. It may be tweaked in the future or something like that. I think how we present it would encourage people to use it more or less. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a direct comparison, is not the right word, but it reminded me of like the W3C document maturity levels, or whatever it's called. I can't remember what they are called, or not, but we could have different levels.
Maturity is a good word.
Different levels of maturity.
Yeah.
And these are people who nitpick on specific words and meanings, and they come up with some words that mean what they want them to mean, or what they want to convey. So yeah, maybe thinking of it in that light could be helpful.
Yeah, maturity sounds reasonable to me. Another thing I'll point out just for context is that this idea of experimental features being enabled by default is something that ECMAScript does as well. They in fact they don't allow something to be ultimately promoted to the spec until all the implementations support it and it's enabled. Which is a kind of a different dynamic than we have right now, where we generally specify something and then people implement it. And I think it would be great if we could end up something somewhere more like what ECMAScript is doing, where something gets promoted because it's supported, rather than, we throw it out there and hope people implement it.
I think because of the problems that we mentioned earlier, where implementers just kind of do what they want anyway, maybe we shouldn't rely on all the implementations support a given feature. Maybe we should have some other lower threshold.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I don't think that ECMAScript is really also necessarily 100% either. I think just like their major players, people who are in their committee, all of the implementations involved in their committee need to support it, I guess, or something like that. But yeah, I agree. Good point.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it slightly concerning that we could have. I guess people using those features need to be aware that what they're creating is potentially not interoperable. And I don't know how ECMAScript deal with this. I mean, there's often quite a long lag from releases to people actually using it in production and tools being upgraded. But like the stuff in other specs which goes out in terms of web stack or gets deprecated even. So yeah, I'm just wrestling with how can we use parts of what they're doing for ECMA but not all of it, if that makes sense. because I don't necessarily think the JSON schema is good parallel. I mean, you don't like the browser makes the best attempt it can to process stuff like HTML. Even if it's not completely valid, it makes its best attempt to try and do what it thinks you probably wanted. We don't want JSON schema implementations to be guessing what it thinks you probably wanted. Like, we want JSON schema implementations to be, compliant to what the specification says, or they're not useful. I'm not sure if that really made sense.
Yeah, I think so. It's a slightly different dynamic. Yeah, I don't think it's going to make it's not going to be all that much different. I think what we did with disallowing unknown properties or keywords is essentially addressing that to the degree that I think it needs to be addressed.
So if an implementation doesn't support a particular experimental keyword, even when it should, say that it doesn't know about it or whatever,
yeah,
then implementation is going to throw an error.
Right. And that's not perfect because, if there's a breaking change, which hopefully we make sure things are stable or relatively stable enough that they're not going to change drastically. But if it does, user could see a change in behavior from when they wrote the schema to later on when the keyword evolved.
It's important to recognize that the implementation has to implement the evolved keyword in order for them to see the change. It's not just we make the spec change. It seems obvious when you say it, but still probably bears saying.
Yeah, and likely people won't be updating their implementation or well, they will update their implementation, run their tests, and see that their the keyword is not behaving the same, right? But it's so it's not going to be like a full surprise. They'll be like, oh, I updated and then it broke, so they know to go and fix something. That is to say, it shouldn't break productions, because of those changes. Those should be caught ahead of time. Well, I think this has been a good discussion. Is there any other topics that we want to cover? We've got about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to leave a little bit of time for anything else. Guess I'll mention real quick, I'm going to be out on Thursday and Friday, just to let everybody know. Just when Bed's getting back.
A little bit of random news which I just spotted. Visual Studio Code is now going to have a user agent when making HTTP requests. So soon, when stuff gets updated, I don't know what release this is going out in. I don't seem to be able to find that information. It's like the August release, which has lots of things left to do. 289 open issues. Wow. Yeah, it looks like when that goes out, it will have a user agent. So when that happens, we'll be able to potentially see how much traffic is coming from them to us, or from the application rather, which would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, that's good. I was actually just a few days ago looking into deciding whether I want to put a user agent on my JSON schema implementation when it does requests. I kind of haven't decided whether I want to do that or not, because it's a library. And I think what people really need to know from the user agent is the application that's using it. So so I'm not entirely sure. I haven't really decided if it's a good idea for me to include it yet or not.
In other news, I've created and published an alternative to OpenAPI.net, which is called GrayEye. It's GRAEAE. That's the Greek name for the fates, the sisters that share an eye. The idea being that in order for them to share an eye, they have to have a common interface to the eye so that it works for all three of them. And then OpenAPI is that interface. But basically, OpenAPI.net presents .NET models for an OpenAPI document. And then it can do like reference resolution and stuff like that. And probably about a year and a half ago, I proposed that they use my implementation, my JSON schema implementation, in order to enable OpenAPI 3.1 support. And that idea has kind of sat for a year and a half without much movement. So I decided just to do it from scratch on my own. And now I'm building code generation from schemas so that I can do OpenAPI code generation in GrayEye. So yeah, I'm building a code gen library, which will actually inform the IDL vocab stuff that I'm doing as well.
That's great. I love the name.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice work.
All right. Action items. I will update the discussion on spec evolution to reflect what we've discussed today. I feel like there was another thing.
Find out what's going on with Bowtie.
Bowtie, yeah. I think that's more of a personal thing that I gotta deal with than something that comes out of this meeting. But yeah, maybe that was the second thing I was thinking of. Any other thoughts of things that we feel like we need to get done? Oh, Ben's going to review the and approve the markdown conversion.
I need to look at the charter comments and respond to those as well.
Yeah. All right.
As soon as we're done here.
What was that?
I'm going to do that as soon as we're done here.
Okay. All right. I'll capture those action items in the meeting issue. And I think that's enough to call it for today.
Thank you.
All right. Later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.